welcome you to another edition of Being Well Informed. My name is Claudia Barber, and I am the host of this podcast and television program that airs weekly, in which we attempt to discuss issues that are relevant to the community. And of course, today is no exception. We have a wonderful guest on our program today to discuss the issue of structural racism in transportation projects at the federal, state, and local levels. Mr. Samuel Jordan, hello, hello, and welcome to Being Well Informed.
Claudia Barber, good afternoon, and I'm very happy to be your guest on Being Well Informed, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. I see think the theme for today's discussion is going to be structural racism in transportation projects, federal, state,
Yes,
and local.
tell
Excellent
us
timing.
tell us about yourself and how you involved yourself in this coalition called More Transit Equity.
Our coalition is called the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition, and we were formed within hours of Larry Hogan's cancellation of the Red Line Light Rail project in June of 2015.
Mm,
I had already spent about 9 years as a volunteer planner and outreach coordinator in the Red Line planning process, which extended from 2002 under Governor Ehrlich to 2015, when shortly after Hogan had been inaugurated. So that was 13 years. And in that 13 years, hundreds of Baltimoreans, consultants, agency types worked on planning the project, getting full funding, full approval, and it was shovel ready when Governor Hogan was elected. So, having spent that time working on the Red Line project, having traveled to cities around the country, Portland, Seattle, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Denver, Boston, Charlotte, to make sure that we had good practices here in Baltimore, and we knew we did. So we knew that the Red Line was a good, solid project. And in fact, what we can say is we learned along the way what kind of challenges other jurisdictions, other cities and communities had faced in developing a light rail project. You see, there's a kind of fundamental principle that I want to share with you and your audience.
hmm
That is, if you take a breath, take another breath. I invite you to take even a third deep breath. Every breath you have ever taken, every moment you have ever lived in the United States was governed by white supremacy. That's where we start. I sometimes begin a discussion with that formulation and ask if there's anybody who disputes it. You see, that way we put the simple stuff to rest. We're not going to be disputing whether or not there is racism, how much there is, are there good white people? No, we have to talk straight. And to talk straight is to begin where we all can agree. And we can all agree on the fact that white supremacy has governed us every moment of every day we've lived in the United States. Well, what it means also is that all public policy has a racial differential at its core, including public transportation. And after having spent that time on the Red Line project, I focused on the fact that public transportation, and we want to make sure that more and more people know this, is a legacy instrument of control of Black people. If you would try to transport yourself back to the so called period of enslavement and ask yourself, if I were, don't try to overplay it, if I were an enslaver, would I let my chattel property walk off the plantation, go wherever they want, come back if they felt like it, whenever they felt like it? Of course not. Well, that kind of legacy has survived the period of enslavement because the movement of people of color, particularly Black people, has always been monitored, has always been controlled. Public transportation is an instrument of that control when it permits at least the minimum participation of Black people in the economy.
This is
So,
very enlightening. Very enlightening.
well, it leads to issues that we've encountered. For example, once we can agree on that there is structural racism at the base of public transit policy, then we can understand that racism is the most important suppressor of investments in public policy, in public transportation. So, what do we hear when we talk about completing the red line? Even though it was shovel ready, completed, fully approved, and fully funded, there were still people saying that we don't want the red line because Black folks will hop in the uh, red line in West Baltimore and come over to East Baltimore and steal our television sets. That's the craziest thing you can imagine, but that's the Black crime myth. But then we answer, the South did not win the war. This project was fully funded, fully approved, and shovel ready when Larry Hogan was elected. So that is not a loss. That's a victory by any definition you might want to use.
So
So don't be telling us that we got to be concerned about white fragility. Claudia, I'm not sure if your audience hears a discussion about public policy like this often,
mhm.
but we should break it down to the fundamentals
So if the Red
always.
Line project was fully funded, how did that get reversed or in terms of government power?
It's a horror story because it flashed by. Larry Hogan, when he was elected, exercised the executive authority of his position as the governor and simply halted it. He rang up the Federal Transit Administration and says, "We're not doing it." And we have what's called a record of decision. That's the last hoop that you've jumped through to get a $900 million grant from the federal government. And once you jump through that last hurdle, that's the environmental impact study evaluation, they give you the green light, and the green light is called a record of decision. It means we now have recorded a decision to let you begin spending our money. Okay, well, that's where Hogan went. He went to the FTA, talked about the record of decision, and says, I'm rescinding it. We're not going to take the money. $900 million he gave back to the federal government.
It was that easy.
He's the governor. You can't, the governor, nobody can spend money from the state's treasurer but the governor. You can override his veto. You can do everything you want. You can jump up and down the streets of Annapolis, but you cannot. No one can spend money from the state's budget but the governor.
Okay.
And when the governor says, "I'm not spending the money," you can't force him to do it. Now there are very few bills like utilities or some special emergency payments and budget outlays that have to be paid no matter what. But in general, with respect to the general fund, with respect to pools like the state's transportation trust fund, only the governor can spend the money. So when the governor says, I don't want it, and that's it, because the state is the sponsor. Baltimore City, Baltimore County were contributors to the red line, not sponsors, because the sponsor has to have the financial wherewithal to guarantee payments in the event of overruns. The city of Baltimore doesn't have that kind of deep pockets or uh, bonding capacity in the financial markets. So that led to Hogan's having complete executive autocratic control over that decision. He didn't have to consult with anybody, and he
Mm.
did not. So, in addition to us forming BTEC within hours of his cancellation, I personally drafted and hand delivered the first of two Title VI complaints against the governor and the state for cancellation of the red line. This was his best platform he would ever have to state why he did it. Let's have some reasoning. That's what the Title VI complaint is all about, that
Right.
there has been a disproportionately adverse impact on people of color. Well, he refused to answer at all. So there's no report, any analysis, any kind of study that shows that the project was a boondoggle. He says it was a boondoggle, but he never did say why when he had the chance to say why under scrutiny and under oath. So we didn't get anything. His buddy Donald Trump shut down a Title VI complaint.
Mm.
and shut it down. And also, when he notified that it was shut down, he also said there were no findings. Okay, no explanation and no findings. You can rarely shut down an administrative complaint with simply saying no findings. You either say the claims had no merit. That's usually, well, allegations had no merit. These people are off base, and then shut it down. But you offer something. Okay, they did.
Right.
The Trump administration and Larry Hogan and in that administration were so dismissive of our rights under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that the governor and the president said, "Hey, forget those people." Well, that traumatized the Obama administration because it was at the end of the Obama administration, the transition to uh, the Trump era. And you see, in order to be a Republican stud at that time, you had to do what Larry Hogan did. He did exactly what his buddy Chris Christie did in New Jersey. Chris Christie denied, sent back, rescinded in the very same way about 1.3, 1.4 billion dollars for repairs to the tunnel under the Hudson River because the Republican Party playbook at the time was don't do anything that lets President Obama look good, okay,
Mm.
including making sure you had $1.4 billion to make repairs under the Hudson Tunnel or $900 million to complete the Red Line in Baltimore. So those two governors, they called themselves twins, they gave the money back. Hogan gave it back because his buddy Chris Christie had given his back.
I
Okay,
see.
now because of it, so much more money. Well, inflation, the cost is up, and time has passed, so
Hmm.
we've lost. No one yet in M.MTA and the Hogan administration has calculated what we've lost to the state's economy, not only the regional economy, by not building the red line. But if you want to get an idea of what that could mean, take a look at the difference between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore since 1968, 69. The
Hmm.
difference is prosperity because you have now a reliable, equitable public transit system anchored by light rail. Now, it's not perfect. Black folks are still fighting against gentrification and displacement in Washington, D.C., and we're going to have to fight here. But we can anticipate it, which makes it easier. But the point is, we've got the wherewithal with a transit system like this to not only improve transit equity, but to transform the regional economy. Larry
Now,
Hogan knew that and was too good for us Negroes.
during the Hogan administration, there has also been talk of a purple line. So,
Yes,
what happened there?
he he canceled the red line and he approved the purple line. The purple line has been under construction actually for about 2 years. Then it was interrupted by a lawsuit. But the purple line is a 15-mile surface rail system from Bethesda in Montgomery County to New Carrollton in Prince George's County. And along that purple line, there have already been $12 billion in committed projects that are still with that project, even though construction has been delayed 4 years, because a fixed guideway is what banks want to invest in.
Hmm.
In fact, the mantra in the industry is development follows rail, buses follow development. Development follows rail, buses follow development. So when you go to Washington D.C. and go to Gallery Place,
Hmm.
go to Bethesda Road, go to Easton Market, Petworth. What you're looking at is development in Washington D.C. that was attracted to light rail, was attracted to the metro
Hmm.
because banks invest. What we tell people is banks don't invest in bus stops. They invest where they're going to have a permanent customer base, permanent pedestrian traffic, permanent mixed use, mixed income base around them. That's the story of New York. That's the
So,
story of
you see a
Washington,
lot
D.C.
of developments like condominiums and maybe apartment houses near subway stops?
That's exactly what we see. But see, you know, Claudia, I'm glad you mentioned that because it does attract that kind of development. You know, if you went to a bank and said, I want $3 million. I'm a small businessman. I need $3 million because, and I got a great enterprise and bus stop right there on the corner. They will laugh you out of the bank and give you a brochure and walk you out of the bank and say, come back when you understand what enterprise is. Bring us a fixed guideway. Your transit system doesn't even have to tell you when they change the bus stop. So why do you think we're going to invest in a bus stop?
Hmm.
You invest in a fixed guideway station, a transit hub, where just like New York, subway's been there for 100 years. That's what the banks want, security for their investment.
Now, the work of the Baltimore Transit Equity has been stretched out for many, many years. So, what is it that the Baltimore Transit Equity has done, and what is currently on the table right now?
Okay. And our coalition is called the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition,
Coalition.
BTEC, right?
Thank you.
BTEC. You know, one is our mission is very simple to build and lead an informed, resolute regional constituency that will demand and pursue the completion of the Red Line Light Rail project. That's our mission.
Beautiful.
Okay. Along the way, though, you know, you have to keep learning and stay alert. Along the way, when we saw how the system worked, when we saw, so we knew that what Hogan was doing was his best impersonation of George Wallace. Okay. This is too good for those black folks. And you see, and you know, in public policy, anything for black people and children is too expensive. Okay. So what we saw was this, that we need to develop a culture, a demand, and a process by which we begin anticipating the completion of the red line and build for it. So when we talk about, and I'm hoping I'm getting around to answering your question if you want to
Hmm.
rephrase it, but what we're getting to is that we have the we have the mission now, we have the opportunity now, and I want to make sure that I'm answering this question, Claudia,
Hmm.
because we're
You
at a
are.
crossroads. We're at a
Yes.
crossroads, and the crossroads is this: we want to make sure there's a definitive demarcation between the Hogan past and the Moore Miller future in transportation. So we're trying to get this next administration not to adopt Hogan legacy policies in transportation. 8 years has done nothing. So why do we trust his plans now? So it's sort of a roundabout way of saying where we think we're going to have to go. But rephrase your question, Claudia, if you will, and make sure I'm answering it.
Well, I just wanted to know the projects that the
Okay,
Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition is working on,
sure.
and how that's kind of weaving in really with the new administration coming on board just weeks
Right.
away.
There's a couple things. In addition to completing, one of the things that we've promised this new administration is that we'll help revive the public support for the red line. You see,
Okay.
there are a lot of people who don't know what has happened to it. A lot of people who've moved in and out of the corridor and need to be refreshed. Okay. The other is that we're working on a piece of legislation that we've uh, been advocating through and ushering through the legislative process for 2 years already. It's called the Transportation Equity Act. And in this last session, we got veto proof votes in both houses. The governor didn't sign it, but you see, it was we had those two uh, developments in both houses, no opposition. So we think we'll get it passed in this coming session. Okay, so we're working on that. But what it does is, for the first time, it enforces the Title VI protections at the state level.
Hmm.
You'd be surprised that since 1964, not one state enforces Title VI. It's enforced only by the federal government, Claudia. And if
Wow.
the federal government does not have a robust and uniform enforcement program of Title VI, it isn't enforced. So Maryland does not enforce Title VI. It's whatever M.MTA says.
My goodness,
Yes.
that's huge
So we're working
for
on it.
states not to be enforcing Title VI.
Absolutely. So we're trying to frame our movement, our work at BTEC, as a civil rights issue. It's a civil
It
rights
is.
issue, it's a human rights issue, but it is an equal justice issue and an equal protection under the law issue. When Hogan canceled the red line, what he did in effect was deny Baltimore black people protection under the law, equal protection under the law. And what do? Well, black folks finance our own discrimination, don't we? That we
Mm.
keep paying taxes in spite of the worst thing that can ever happen to us. Well, we finance it. Okay,
So,
so
what about the Transportation Equity Act? How does that play a role? Is that getting us closer to Title VI being implemented in the state of Maryland?
yes, and I would convey it in its basic requirements. Under Title VI, whenever a transportation agency that receives at least $1 in federal funds makes a change in policy, major, minor, but when they make a change in policy, they have to have assessed the what's called the transit equity. They have to give it a transit equity analysis. Will the benefits and harms will they be distributed equitably? Will anybody be more adversely impacted than anybody else? Will someone be more beneficially affected than anybody else? Well, that has to be weighed. And when that is done, you see, under Title VI, then the project can go. But if it isn't done, it should be denied. It should be halted. Well, Transit Equity Act, for the first time, makes that state law. And you see, it's more enforceable at the state level. So when M.MTA were to make a uh, decision like canceling the red line, prior equity analysis would prevent that. So had that Transit Equity Act been enforced, the red line would never have been canceled. Had the Transit Equity Act been enforced, the idea of the Hogan administration putting the 20% of the budget cuts under the COVID on the backs of the core bus service would never have been proposed. So what we're saying is, so it's historic in that sense. All right. So we're telling the governor, it's been through the legislature, got a great passage in the last legislature. When you sign it, you'll have one of the most effective instruments in your policy patch or uh, portfolio briefcase to address issues of discrimination, of uh, disproportionate adverse impacts when you can pass this act and you get the Title VI protections at the state level. Maryland would be the first state in the union to do that.
Now, what about the President Biden's infrastructure bill that was passed this year? Is that helpful in bringing such projects as the Red Line back on track, or no?
It is helpful. In fact, remember the Biden administration, because the Trump administration was one term, there are veterans in the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, who were there in the FTA when Trump came to office and Hogan canceled that money. Well, they were traumatized. They couldn't believe it. He gave us back $900 million. Well, they have given Baltimore priority as a result.
Oh, good.
Right. So what we're doing is fighting for completion of the red line with that priority. And uh, the Biden administration, Senators Van Hollen and Cardin, have put money in the transportation infrastructure bill that would direct money to Maryland when Maryland commits to completing the red line. Okay, so what we want our new governor to do is to go to the FDA and say, hello, how are you? We're the folks from Baltimore. We had that project canceled and we got a priority from the Biden administration because there were about 3 or 4 other projects, Claudia, like the red line, that were canceled by the Trump administration, although they were shovel ready. So
Hmm.
they have a priority with the Biden administration. So there's money in that infrastructure bill for completion of those projects. These are legacy projects, they call them. So there's money for us to get started. And see, that's how we know when Larry Hogan is serious or not about his so-called plans for the future. If they have no connection whatsoever to a source of money already available, you know that means he's not serious. How is he going to have the whole state pay for all of this? No, he can't do it. But he hasn't done so. Not in 8 years has the Hogan administration gone to the FTA and say, how do we complete the red line? That's how we know he's never planning to do it. And that's what he wants to pass off to Westmore.
Wow, this has been very enlightening. Do you now if we envisioned the Red Line project, I mean, what areas are we speaking directly about in terms of jurisdiction, counties that are crossed, etc.?
The project was approved, and the red line only serves two jurisdictions directly: Baltimore City and Baltimore County.
Okay.
Okay, the state, as I mentioned, about $1.3 billion from the State Transportation Trust Fund with the increase in the gas tax, but $200 million from Baltimore City and about $60 million from Baltimore County. 30% of the red line is in Baltimore County. So we can't build it without them. We can't complete it without Baltimore County. And both jurisdictions contributed. So what we're doing then is uh, one, making sure that the two jurisdictions are on board. And then we get the federal funds when they reevaluate the final impact study. And if when they approve it, that is, we reevaluate the alignment, if anything has changed, or if not, if there are modifications to be made, we make them, and then we get an approval. We get the record of decision. Then we get the federal money back again.
We again addressed the red line. We mentioned the purple line. What about maglev? There's been a lot of talk about that. Is that an approved project, semi-approved? What?
It's gaining political favor. It's not actually what Baltimore needs at the moment, and that's what our position has been. That is, the maglev, and I think your audience knows that's for magnetic levitation rail system.
Mm-hmm.
It's called a rail, but it has no rails. It floats on a magnetic cushion, and the interesting technology behind it. Well, they're these super, and you can go and achieve super speeds. So Asian countries, Japan, China, Korea, South Korea, that is, have these. Germany, in Europe, have these super speed trains, maglev, levitated. They float about 2, 3 inches above the rail system. Anyway, and the promise of the maglev is to get to Washington D.C. from Baltimore in about 15 minutes.
Mm.
Okay, its basis is planned for a DC to New York maglev. But here's the problem: if we look at what we need and do what we need to do first, we wouldn't do the maglev first for a number of reasons. One is it's destructive. It's environmentally destructive. It goes to the wetlands in the uh, national park between Washington and Baltimore. But it also doesn't bring that much development to the terminus for the maglev in Baltimore. It would terminate in Cherry Hill, South Baltimore, part of one of Baltimore's poorest underserved communities. So there won't be any development there. The people who will be using the maglev will not be coming home in Cherry Hill, because in
Mm.
Cherry Hill, you see, there's very few people who need to get to Washington D.C. for $180 in 15 minutes. You can drive in 35 minutes and get there for less than a quarter of a tank of gas. Okay, so that's one problem. The people who will be using it don't live in Cherry Hill in Baltimore, so they won't be staying there. They will have a parking lot and no services and no development. Okay, but they will have sped from Baltimore to Washington D.C. in 15 minutes for their business. Okay, so that's one thing. What we need instead in that part of Baltimore is the red line light rail project. We have, and I'm using a stereotype, but if we have, you know, a single mom with two children under six, and she's got to get them to daycare in McElderry, that's a district in Baltimore, and then on her way to Bellevue to get to work in the morning, and she's got 45 minutes. She's not in need of a super train between Baltimore and DC.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, she needs to put $1.80 in the fare box and get to childcare and get on to work. All right, so we want to put maglev in its context. What are the priorities? Now we know that there should be experimentation with transit modes and so on. So, but you got to do it according to, first, do what the people need. Everything we encounter in life tells us first you build a foundation.
Then there's the issue of a new and developing issue is free bus
Yes.
transportation.
It,
That's
it,
becoming something that could be on the verge in the District of Columbia, and it was explored in the city of Annapolis legislature.
it is. It has been, and it's growing around the country. But there are about 11 jurisdictions down the country that have zero fare or free fare transit.
Wow.
And yes, so it's a growing tendency now, and we're glad. We did try it in Annapolis. We'll get back to it. I think we'll get it soon. But it has come to Washington, D.C., and the mayor has said that there will be permanent free fare. Well, the reason it can be done is because, one, public transportation is not self-financing. The most you can get at the fare box in a bus
Mhm.
system, like say Baltimore's, is 28% of the operating funds covered by the fare box. It never pays for itself. So
Okay.
what we did in Annapolis was just ask Annapolis to look at what jurisdictions can do all over the country. Subsidize the fare box. You don't have to charge people the fare box. They're never going to pay for the system anyway. Okay, so what is it? It's an irritant if you compare it to other things that you can do for funds in your town. You can do parking fees. Okay, look
Mhm.
at Annapolis. That was an example that we can use. Here we have people who are city, state employees getting free parking for two, maybe three cars in a family, and you can't afford to give to $1.80 for a man trying to get back and forth to work, or a woman trying to get back and forth to work, take care of their families. You can't. We can't afford $1.80 or what? $3.60 in a day for this person and this family when you can give a state employee who's already making a middle income salary, you give them $15 of free parking for two cars every day. Come on, that's hardly fair. No one's going to argue that that's fair. So all over the country, when you look at it, look at the budget, what you see is this: transit costs it's a fraction of any jurisdiction's budget compared to what it's worth to the economy, to the workforce, to the society itself. So Washington, D.C. has taken a look and says, we can find other ways to cover the cost at the fare box. What we've been collecting at the fare box, we don't really need to do because the mayor can say, because Washington, D.C. has such prosperity right now, we can tack on a penny to the real estate tax. We can tack on two pennies to the real estate tax and still cover everything in the fare box and the transit system. So states are looking at it. Why make that an issue? Because once you do that, then you get the return on investment. The return on investment in public transportation is $4 for every dollar you invest. We will get that return on investment if we did that in Annapolis, if we did it in the state of Maryland.
You know, we have covered so much and we're not even finished. So we must invite you back again. But
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samuel Jordan, for all that you've shared with us today. It's been a wonderful program. And thanks for being on board and being our special guest today.
Judge Barber, my pleasure.